20 years ago, I retired from my work as a park ranger in the Bear Lodge district. That land was not meant for man. When I first took the job around the turn of the millennium, I was already well past my youth. I worked as a police officer in a past life, but the chaotic city weathered my soul. I thought that working in nature, while still donning a uniform and wielding some form of authority, would satisfy all my mind craved. One night, however, I learnt that I had not escaped the horrors of the world. Understood that there is no escaping the horrors of our world, or any other world that may exist out of sight. "I'm heading to the butte," Connie said. "Oh, surely not," I scoffed. "It's soothing, Rick," my fellow park ranger explained. "There's history in that rock. The Native Americans knew it, and I know it." I rolled my eyes in response. Connie was a handsome woman. She was the only woman who ever looked twice at me. We had a dalliance back in 2001, though it seems unfair to reduce our connection in such a way. We said those 3 binding words from time to time. In the modern age, we might have said that we were seeing each other. We weren't putting a label on it. The point is that I cared deeply for Connie. However, her obsession with that monolithic rock was deeply disconcerting. "Last night I found some climbers attempting the ascent after dark," she said. "I just want to make sure they haven't, come back for another go tonight. We don't want to scrub teenage innards off the ground in the morning, eh?" I opened my mouth. Connie leapt into her vehicle before I voiced my opinion. Infuriating, given that I had to stay behind and hold the post. So, as was the case on most nights, I stayed in the watchtower and eyeballed the rock of Bear Lodge from my elevated perch, whilst wondering what my friend was doing out there. Wondering why it all made me so uneasy. The following evening, when Connie missed her shift, the long brewing fear in my belly was finally justified. I knew something had happened to her before I even rang her friends and family. I knew they were going to tell me that they hadn't seen her in the past 24 hours. Contacting them was just a formality. I was ticking all of the boxes. Buying time, in all honesty. Summoning the courage to face what I had long avoided. Bear Lodge. I sat in my Range Rover for a while. From the comfort of its interior, I felt separate from reality. I sat and watched the bouncing branches of fir trees, caught by rays of moonlight, and I remembered why I preferred the watchtower. Black Hills embodies nothingness, something almost impossible to describe. I longed for the background ambience of wildlife, like a heartbroken soul who lets the radio bellow ceaselessly in a bid to mimic company. There was no sign of life amongst the trees, not a peep from the pitch-black woodlands. Exhaling heavily, I limbered up, stretching my limbs. Then I finally twisted the key in the ignition, startling myself with the sound of the Rover springing to life. The quietness had been so prominent that the roaring engine tore through my body. I drove along leaf-strewn, long-faded roads. I've never felt as vulnerable as I did on that night. Even in the metallic cocoon of my vehicle, I started to abandon that sense of security. Started to feel like an ant in a cobweb, awaiting the arachnid's arrival. Some unseen hand strangled my upper chest when Connie's beloved rock appeared on the near horizon. I could feel a pulse in my eardrums, as if my head were dividing, and there was no longer any reasonable way to ignore it. Something wasn't right about Bear Lodge. The animals must have known that, just like the humans who lived there long ago. They fled, because they'd seen something. Something Connie saw. Something she had run towards. "You're being foolish," I told myself. "You'll get out of this car and hear the chitter-chatter of woodland creatures once more. Just you wait." I hoped for that more than anything else, but instinctive dread is more powerful than any rational idea. It seeps into not only flesh, but all organs. A rapidly pounding heart, strained lungs, an aching, haunted brain. No matter how much one wrestles, fear prevails. In this instance, as irrational as that fear seemed, I knew that my imagination had not conjured some false reality. "Unless you've eaten something rotten, always trust your gut," my mother used to say. She also told me not to become a police officer, however, and I was starting to wish I'd kept that vocation. Suddenly, the violent streets of the city felt less oppressive than the picturesque Black Hills. And that thought only strengthened when I found Connie's Range Rover at the foot of Bear Lodge. I hurriedly pulled alongside her vehicle, praying that she'd simply twisted an ankle the night before and needed assistance. It had only been 24 hours, so I told myself she'd be okay. What if something has mauled her? I fearfully wondered. I lacked the creativity to consider any terror greater than a black bear, but that would change before the night had ended. I scurried out of my vehicle, flashlight at the ready, and began to stride towards the rock which rose 5,000 feet above me. My torchlight illuminated sparsely placed trees, but I've never felt quite so claustrophobic. Never felt so keenly observed. And with every passing moment, the watcher grew nearer. I didn't understand how I knew that. A piercing wail interrupted my thoughts. A sound like nothing I'd heard before, and nothing I've heard since. A shriek like that of a wounded newborn baby, but not a human one. I knew that. Just as I knew I was not alone in the park. And I was not, as I had hoped, comforted by that fact. Then came a rustling. Shrubbery disturbed by some hidden thing. Tumbling rocks dislodged by a nearby shape. Something moved in the vicinity. "This is it," I accepted. "This is how I die." I prepared to face death itself. Some reaper coming to take me to whatever does or does not lie beyond our world. Instead, two men emerged, supporting Connie between them. She was limping. "Rick," she wheezed. "Connie!" I cried, running towards her. "What happened?" One of the men, the elder of the two, instantly raised a finger to his lips and motioned for me to follow. "Who are you?" I whispered. "Dakota," the man replied. "And this is my son, Elan. Your friend is fortunate that she wandered near our reservation. Now we must move quickly and quietly. Understand?" I nodded, and when my Range Rover came into view, I started to lunge forwards. Elan, however, grabbed my wrist and viciously shook his head. "No! You drew it here with the sound of the engine," Elan whispered. "And no living thing can outrun it. No machine is fast enough. We must hide until morning." Dakota guided us to a mound of rocks that we rearranged into an uninspiring makeshift den. "What about your reservation?" I asked. "Wouldn't it be better to take Connie there?" "No, it was waiting for us," Dakota explained. Besides, we heard your car. We had to rescue you. And that is all I will say on the matter. We should not be speaking at all. The four of us slithered into the tiny hovel that Dakota had created. The man and his son sported blue faded jeans and matching winter jackets, sported identical, horrified expressions as the father explained that they found Connie screaming in the forest. Only they were brave enough to venture into the trees to save her. "It found me," she shakily told me, eyes absent. "What found you?" I quietly asked, still not understanding what had haunted my three companions. "Wendigo," Dakota coldly replied. The four of us fell silent for several long moments. It was a word that meant nothing to me. I lifted an eyebrow at the Native American elder, and he simply grimaced in response. "In our culture, the Wendigo is something to be feared. We do not cross its path, but foolish Americans fail to heed our warnings," the father quietly said. "You build your watchtowers and litter these grounds with tourists. None of you have any respect for sacred things." "Dad, it's not their fault," Elon started. Dakota waved his hand dismissively. "Don't be soft, son. These people do not know of the old things that live here. Soon they will. They will see the thing of which I speak." "What is it?" I asked. "Some wild animal?" Dakota clearly stilled his rage, losing patience with me. "It is not a living thing, Ranger. Pray that we do not catch its eye. And if fate should smile upon us, we may well make it to morning." "What is it?" I urgently repeated. "An evil spirit," Elon piped up before Dakota lost his temper. "The Wendigo possesses people who have become, either intentionally or unintentionally, less than people. Some say it claims the bodies of those who resort to cannibalism. Some say greed and weakness make one vulnerable. This curse transforms people into..." "Enough, Elon," Dakota scolded in a raised voice. "We have said all that needs to be said." A wail sliced into the conversation. That horrible, indescribable wail. Connie burrowed her face into my shoulder to muffle her staggered cries. "I hear it constantly," she whispered, "even when it isn't calling." Dakota and Elon shared a knowing look. A slight, fleeting glance, which told me that they knew far more about the Wendigo than they were revealing. Connie had said or done something to unsettle them before I arrived, and that only exacerbated the pit of terror in my stomach. Elon yelped, clasping his mouth, as he peered out of the den. "What?" I near silently asked. "Dad?" Elon started. "I know," Dakota nodded, also peering over the wall. "I see it." The courageous father clambered out of the rock fortress that he had constructed, and the rest of us watched with perplexed expressions. "Dad, what are you doing?" Elon whisper-screeched. "Shh!" Dakota sharply shushed his son before dragging one boot across the dirt. When I poked out of the hole, I realised what had concerned the pair of them. A bloody trail led from the cluster of fir trees to our den. A well-lit runway for the vile creature, who I felt barrelling towards us from the depths of the forest. Dakota was attempting to conceal the track. I shone the torch onto Connie and noticed that her trouser leg had been hiked upwards. A wooden splint supported her bloody shin, and a festering wound eyeballed me. It almost appeared to be squirming, changing. A trick of the light, I thought. "Turn that off," Elan hissed, nodding at my torch. I complied, watching in silent dread as Dakota used leaves to cover bloody streaks in the grass. It was a haphazard clean-up job, but there was no time to do better. We were all aware of how loud the Wendigo's most recent howl had been. And then a twig crunched. Dakota immediately shook his head at Elan, who had widened his eyes. I held the son back, seeing that he clearly wanted to emerge from our hiding place to save his father. The old man simply smiled warmly at his boy. Then, in a burst of rapid, soundless movement, a spindly creature of unfathomable enormity broke free from the darkness to seize Dakota. It hurled his body into a nearby tree, like a discarded plaything. The father's form crumpled, bones splintering and blood splattering. I contained Elan's screams with my hand as he started to bawl. The horrifying apparition was barely distinguishable in the dark, and I am thankful for that. But I saw far more of the fiend than any living person should see. An emaciated shape, with two horrendous horns, like misshapen forks, protruding from its head. Other than its outline, however, the creature remained mostly shrouded by the darkness. None of its facial features were discernible. The father spluttered red specks from his lips, but did not utter a word. Was barely audible, in fact. He refused to give the beast the satisfaction of a blood-curdling death cry. Dakota embraced death with silence and dignity. The Wendigo unleashed another feverish shriek. Then it slid Dakota's still living body into its gaping jaws. Predatory teeth ripped through the father's flesh and bones, causing the man to finally unleash a scream. And when the gaunt ghoul finished consuming Dakota's legs, the father's screams ended. Finally, he had been offered the forgiving release of death. The Wendigo was so preoccupied with its fresh meal that it didn't seem to have noticed us. And eventually, it began to walk away. Elan's icy tears leaked through the cracks of my fingers, but I looked at him sternly, and he nodded to indicate that he would be quiet, so I removed my hand. The young man remained silent. All of us remained silent. We shivered until morning, then we hoisted Connie to the Range Rover. She was fading, and her wounds seemed to have worsened over the hours. Through some fortune, nevertheless, Elan and I managed to rescue her. I drove straight to the hospital, and my friend received emergency treatment. She survived. The son returned to the reservation as soon as we had safely delivered Connie to the hospital. He did not speak a word to either of us. And Connie quit after that. Not just the job, but me. The world. Everything and everyone. I stopped working as a park ranger too, of course, but it was about more than trauma for Connie. She left for some other reason. Part of me has felt diseased since the last day I saw her, when she was discharged from the hospital. She was well, physically, but her eyes were different. Her words, few and far between, were not hers. I keep thinking about the look that Dakota and Elan exchanged. Keep thinking about the unnatural wound on my friend's leg. Keep thinking, most importantly, about the fact that nobody has seen her since 2001. I fear, to this day, that she returned to Bear Lodge. Not as Connie, but something else.